Nice to have you on stream, Scott. Hit me up. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask about not so much a debate because I don't know. It's more about me asking questions out of curiosity, if that's all right.
Totally, go for
But
it.
yeah, I was kind of curious. I've heard the term non-binary before, and I've always just kind of gone with it without ever really sort of thinking critically about what that means to me. When people say they're non-binary, I'm like, oh, okay, you don't subscribe to the traditional gender norms, I guess. Um, but thinking about it in terms of, I think you've brought it up before, gender as a spectrum, and especially as like a bimodal distribution on a spectrum.
hmm
Trying to think about that a little bit more in depth has me wondering uh, what what kind of is the spectrum, because it's really hard to like look at a person and say, well, you're 34 units female and 54 units male, or something like that. um,
Yeah,
and I would
totally.
think that if you're going to have sort of language like really scientific language like spectrum and bimodal distribution, that there would be sort of like metrics or things that one could measure definitively to back up the placement of an individual trait on this spectrum. Can you speak more to me about that?
Yeah, totally. So I think that if we're kind of analyzing these things, it's important to note that there is a lot of different concepts which roughly get conflated whenever we kind of use the term gender. So first we can think of biological sex, as in these physical characteristics which are dimorphic between male and female bodies, and biological sex itself accounts for lots of different characteristics. It's not just
Hmm.
the chromosomes you have or the way in which you can reproduce, but also things like anatomical features, hormonal features, the way your genes actually express themselves. Kind of the distributions of different brain matter regions also appears to be sex dimorphic, at least to an extent. And so, biological sex is all this physical stuff associated with male and female, maleness and femaleness. And yeah, sex itself would absolutely be kind of bimodally distributed along a spectrum. But in a way where it's much more so multidimensional because there's lots of different characteristics. You could
Yeah.
have somebody who like has a lot of has their physical characteristics be entirely in line with someone that is kind of like a typical male, yet chromosomally they would have XX chromosomes. This would be like somebody with de la Chapelle syndrome, for example. And so we can kind of place them on this biological sex spectrum in kind of like each of these different categories. So that's kind of how I describe biological sex. Then we can move from kind of like the physical biological layer to like the social layer, where we examine gender as a social phenomenon. We can talk about
Hmm.
kind of the roles and expectations that we assign to people based on how we perceive them, and we can also talk about how people perform certain roles, certain forms of presentation, kind of as a form of gender expression. So there's experiential gender, which is like kind of how society genders and treats you, and then there's performative gender, which is kind of how you express your gender at a social level. So social gender, I would absolutely also say exists along a spectrum and probably is more so bimodally distributed in terms of how it actually works in practice. We can think about how there's kind of these two rough averages at masculine versus feminine presentation, masculine versus feminine gender roles. But then if we kind of like break down the spectrum, we can look at how some kind of like super tough masculine bodybuilder versus like a femboy, they're definitely going to experience gender rather differently in how society perceives and treats them.
Sure.
There's definitely kind of that spectrum going on, and similar with how they would perform or present their gender as well. And then we can move
I
from
was
this. Oh yeah, go for it.
I was talking with a friend of mine who's transgender, and I was lucky enough to know her both before she transitioned, before she even realized she was transgender, and now after she's transitioned and gotten fairly comfortable with her new social identity.
Totally, totally.
And we were having a similar conversation of like, well, what does it mean when you say X, Y, and Z? And I thought there was a really, I mean, you'll correct me if it's not particularly helpful, but I thought it was particularly helpful analogy that we kind of came to, was that you could think of life as like a restaurant, like the restaurant of life. And this person, my friend, she went into this restaurant, and when she sat down, the restaurant really only prepares two meals. It prepares the steak meal and it prepares the salad meal. And she was told, well, you're going to order the steak meal. And then a little ways through eating that meal, she kind of saw other people having the salad, and she's like, I'd really rather the salad. So she returned the steak meal and she got a salad meal instead. And that was kind of an analogy for, well, life told her that she was a boy at first, but then as she sort of grew into herself, she realized, nah, that's not really what's happening for me.
Yeah.
I'm a girl. I'm more of a salad person in the analogy,
I
let's
think I
say.
think that's a great analogy. And then if you want to kind of like add non-binary identity into the analogy, you can talk about how well there might be some people who want to have a little steak and a little salad, or maybe there's somebody that wants to have
Exactly.
pasta for dinner. You know,
Yeah.
I'd rather just like let people have what they want to have for dinner rather than trying to fit people into nice little neat binary boxes that don't really exist in objective reality. Um,
Right.
and so
That's
then
kind of that's what we did with that analogy is like the steak has a beer with it and some mashed potatoes and but the salad has like grapefruit and then we talked about like mixing and matching. Well, I want a little bit of
oh
salad, but I also want some shrimp with that. And so that's I guess that's my approach to what this term non-binary means is if you really only believe in the steak meal or the salad meal and maybe even you could switch from going a steak meal to a salad meal, in my head that's still kind of like a binary thinking. But then when you realize, oh, I can have a salad and I can have mashed potatoes and I can have the wine or I could have the mix and match kind of stuff,
totally,
that's
totally.
maybe more a non-binary view of gender. Is that
Yeah, I think that's a
sound
good way
about right?
to kind of approach it. And yeah, the way that I start to explain non-binary identity is where we move up from kind of that social level we were at. So we were at the biological level, then the social level, and we go up to the psychological level where we have people's
Mm,
own internal sense of self, their own internal relationship to their biology and the way in which they're perceived and treated by society. And that's where gender identity lies. And this gender identity seems to be very much so innate inside of people, where they have this sense of who they are and what's right for them. And for a lot of non-binary people, their non-binary identity exists in this psychological level. And there's definitely this push for society to be more inclusive and accepting of non-binary people, and that way we can start to affirm non-binary identity at the social level as well. And I think that's a great strive.
yeah, that was something that was really critical for me for understanding some of the things, especially my friend was saying as she was transitioning, when she was saying, like, I think I've always been a woman. And my knee jerk response to that inside my head, I didn't say this, but my knee jerk response to that was like, what do you mean you've always been a woman? You didn't present as a woman and you weren't physiologically a woman. I don't know in what axis you would have been a woman. And then discovering this kind of like psychological layer, like you were talking about, sort of illuminated to me like that's what she meant. That's what she
Yeah,
meant when she said
it's
she's
it's
always
also
been a
really
woman is
fascinating, especially
yeah.
because like that identity part, where it is definitely something that's very much innate from a very young age. But it's also the kind of thing where it's like you might not even understand what it means. Like I didn't understand that part of me meant that I could be a woman or meant that I was a woman until I was 21 years old. And so it's kind of this thing where like that gender identity was always there, but you might not have had the language or the understanding to interpret that as to what that actually means for you.
Is there is there really a difference, let's say, between because I've met and know several trans well, I've met and know several trans women. I guess I don't know any trans men in my life, but there's definitely some trans women that I know that definitely don't lean into a kind of trans identity. They don't want to be known as a quote unquote trans woman. They just want to be known as a woman.
Mhm.
And then there's also, I've known trans women that are very much like, I'm super proud to be trans, and they sort of lean more into that identity. Is that, would you say, is that also sort of in that gender spectrum, or is that something different?
Yeah, I'd say that definitely kind of has to do with kind of that identity axis of gender. How much they try or how much that transness, that specific aspect of transness, really matters to them as part of their core self identity. There are so many identities that we have about ourselves, from the kind of things we like to the style of relationships we have, to like if you're a sports fan or if you're a gamer, or
Yeah.
there are lots of these kind of identities which are intrinsic to us. And for some people, certain identities tend to be a lot more like impactful, or tend to matter a lot more, or be more core to who they are. And so if somebody holds their transness much more near and dear, yeah, it's totally valid. Meanwhile, somebody holds just their womanhood more near and dear, also valid. And that also might kind of like reflect in how they might present their gender, and that's cool too.
I guess the maybe the last thing that I wanted to touch on was kind of this idea of fluidity with someone's identity. And maybe this is more of like a not a philosophical question of like, is there a core identity that one has from birth to death that they sort of express to varying degrees, or is it a matter of you can be definitely a man at one point in your life and then through the fluidity of your identity become a woman at a different point in your life?
Yeah, I think there definitely is some fluidity to things like gender identity, things like sexual orientation. And our best research on this topic shows that there are definitely things like genetic factors, things like hormonal factors in the womb, which can absolutely influence the identities and kind of the predispositions that we have towards certain things. But it also seems to be the case that there are definitely a lot of people out there that do have somewhat of a more fluid experience. Yeah, we are ultimately a complex combination of biological and sociological factors. But it seems that these kind of like gender identity and sexual orientation style stuff works in a way where, like, once it kind of emerges, it's not something you can like convert someone into or out of. Rather, somebody can gain a better understanding of over time. I know that for like a lot of people that have a more fluid or like sexual orientation or gender identity, it tends to be kind of the things where they're like, I always had these feelings, but I didn't really understand what this fluidity was until I had a better grasp of the concept and the language.
Yeah, I guess that it does kind of seem like certain things can be very fluid, like, ooh, I really enjoyed, maybe the taste of cherries when I was younger, but now I'm not really so much into cherries, to pick on a somewhat trivial characteristic,
Yeah.
versus other characteristics that are much more like sticky, like someone's sexuality, what the kinds of things they're attracted to, let's say. And I wonder if maybe it's just a matter of like the characteristics that are more sticky in human psychology end up being the characteristics that get associated with and build up one sense of identity, such that like, well, maybe in a different universe, whether or not you like cherries is a really sticky thing. If you're born liking cherries, you're going to like cherries for the rest of your life. If you're born not liking cherries, you're not going to like cherries. Maybe because of that, in that society, those people really treat whether or not you're a cherry liker or not as a core part of their identity.
Oh gosh, this really reminds me of the Philosophy Tube video on social construct. If you've seen that one or if you haven't, it's a very good watch.
Oh yeah.
Very much touching on this kind of concept of, well, we could definitely imagine a different world or a different society where certain characteristics have, much greater social
Yeah.
implications than others. And we could even like base our world on, say, whether or not someone is tall versus short. And people would definitely
Yeah.
hold that much more intrinsic to their identity because of the weight in which society places on it.
Interesting. Well, that brings up a question. Do you think that the stickiness of these characteristics are based mostly off of societal influence, or do you think that it's more of a biological, physiological influence?
I really struggle to say if something's like more of one or the other, because ultimately it's really, really hard to make that kind of analysis when we understand the
Yeah.
concept of neuroplasticity, where our brains literally change in response to our social environment. And,
Mm.
genetic expression can be turned on and off by various factors, hormones, influences, experiences. And so, yeah, I think that ultimately, our social experience and our biology is very much linked together, and they're very much a codependent system. So I couldn't really tell you for sure. It seems that they are very much intertwined and both play a big role into that.
You also mentioned something, I think, in yesterday's stream about cis people having gender dysphoria, and
Absolutely.
maybe I should get more clarity on what that means, because my idea, and you'll correct me where I'm wrong, my understanding of gender dysphoria is you brought up those various layers. Gender dysphoria, to my understanding, would be one layer holding inconsistent values with a different layer or something like that. So, like, the gender identity holds an inconsistency with how you present yourself in the world, and maybe the solution is to change your presentation to match your gender identity, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that specifically when I'm referring to gender dysphoria, that would be kind of like a mismatch between your gender identity and something going on in that social level of gender. So it could be something where, you're not able to present yourself in a way that makes you feel comfortable, or it could be a thing where society perceives and treats you in a gender role that just feels completely wrong for you. such as like a pre-transition trans woman who people perceive and treat them as like the gender they were assigned at birth, and how that feels wrong for them. But I think that for cis people, they often have the same kind of feeling of dysphoria when they don't hold up to this kind of gendered ideal of gender identity they have in their head. And this is why I think it's absolutely a form of gender dysphoria, which motivates things like older men receiving hair transplants, motivates things like boob jobs, or even just like, simply changing your presentation to match a more gendered ideal which you might have in your head. I think that those are absolutely influence of gender dysphoria, even in cis people.
That sounds like it could get confused with just people wanting to appear more attractive to themselves and others, or is that
Is
sort of
that
play
just
a
what
part?
that I think that whether or not gender dysphoria is just this desire to have the body align with kind of, or have the body, have your social self align with this ideal you have of yourself, versus if it's something that's kind of like compounding of depression, anxiety, self-image issues, all this stuff. Yeah, it's an interesting medical question, and the medical community is definitely there's definitely debate in the medical community about whether or not, like, our current diagnosis or definition of gender dysphoria is really capturing like a medical phenomenon, or if it's just the idea of trying to make yourself align with your own ideal, but for trans people.
So, like for example, I started balding at a young age because that's just genetics in my family,
Hmm.
and I really tried to fight that for a while with like haircuts to kind of cover it up. And then one day I saw my uncle who just went clean shaven, and I'm like, "Damn, that looks really good. I'm gonna do that." And so I went clean shaven. Uh, does that mean that before I, let's say, in a really kind of loose term, transitioned to a clean shaven man, did I experience gender dysphoria with this idealized
Yeah,
version
I,
of
I think that
myself as a bald person?
I think that yes, and this also might be a good time to bring up the concept of gender euphoria as well, where gender euphoria being the opposite of dysphoria, being positive feelings associated with actually aligning to kind of a gendered ideal. And I think that
Hmm.
it seems like you expressed some feelings of dysphoria with relation to kind of your balding, but then with that clean shaven head, there was that sense of gender euphoria from aligning with that gendered ideal which you desired.
Okay, interesting. So then yeah, that does make me wonder if there is some line somewhere between someone just trying to make themselves feel better in their own body versus true gender dysphoria, or if they're both actually just getting at the same underlying phenomenon, perhaps to various degrees. Huh.
Yeah, I think that I think there's definitely a very strong argument that there is kind of at least enough similarities that we can classify these both of these feelings under under like a broader umbrella term.
Interesting. Um, I did also wanted to ask. I did also want to ask
Mhm.
about, um, and I guess we touched on this a little bit before. Use of the word spectrum with not gender dysphoria, with gender. Use of the word
Yeah.
spectrum. I think I'm getting confused on what the term spectrum means ultimately. In my head, sort of the classic spectrum that I learned about in school would be the electromagnetic spectrum, right? The EM spectrum that photons take on different wavelengths of light and that kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
so typically a spectrum would just refer to a continuous range of values. And then, sometimes we think of like a one-dimensional spectrum where we range from like a minimum to a maximum. But a lot of this like gender stuff and even human biology is less of like a min to max one-dimensional spectrum, but it's much more so a multi-dimensional spectrum where there are lots of different characteristics and they can take on lots of different values. We can break
that's
down gendered presentation into lots of different categories: clothing, hair, mannerisms, all this stuff. We can break down biological sex into like hormones, anatomy, reproduction, and chromosomes. All this different stuff is definitely multidimensional.
I think the number of dimensions isn't what kind of makes me concerned about the use of the word spectrum. I think what concerns me is um, the ability to measure along any one of those dimensions. I can't take someone's outfit and say this is 43 units of femininity and 15 units of masculinity. It's you're either wearing a skirt or you're wearing pants or you're wearing a dress. They're kind of it's a discrete dimension. It's not a continuous dimension. And even in the sense that it's a discrete dimension, it's not really an ordered dimension. I can't say that skirts are closer to dresses than pants or anything like that. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's definitely interesting. I think that some of these categories are absolutely more discrete. Some of them, it's very hard to come up with any kind of like clean ordering. It definitely just goes to show that the waters are muddier, perhaps even muddier than the word
Yeah.
spectrum would imply. I don't know if you want
I
to call
think
it
that's
like
what
a
bugs me.
kind of more like a cloud in a spectrum. That might kind of make more sense, but no,
I
any kind of like attempt to like provide a precise like word or distribution model to like model these concepts. All of these kind of like models which we try to apply are abstractions of what's actually happening in objective reality, which is way more complicated and weird and muddy than
yeah.
any kind of like human abstraction we can make. And I would say that kind of this bimodal spectrum is a much better abstraction than like a binary abstraction. But yeah, I think that if somebody goes and says, well, yeah, there's definitely some problems with kind of like this bimodal abstraction too. Really, it's more so understood as kind of like a multidimensional cloud of characteristics. Yeah, I can't object to that. That it definitely is.
Cool. I was especially didn't know going into asking about the spectrum, and you answered it pretty quickly. What your perspective on when you said it's a continuum, and my question was going to be especially related to something like if we take the EM spectrum, we have photons, they have different wavelengths. You can take a photon, you can really accurately measure the wavelength, and you can say, well, that was a red photon, that was a blue photon. Um, but doing that is we have the wavelength, and then we have the appraisal categories on top of the wavelength by saying red photon, blue photon, X-ray, or something like that, as
Hmm.
opposed to just saying the wavelength of the photon. And my question was going to be, and could still be, I suppose, is the spectrum the measuring of the wavelength, or is it the appraisal categories on top of the wavelength? Because the analogy would be, well, the appraisal categories in gender are, is this a tomboy, is this a femboy, is this a man, is this a woman, kind of
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
those
and
appraisal
actually, this
categories.
brings up a really good point because even though, we can mathematically measure the spectrum of values of wavelengths, it's going to be very hard for you to, like, there's no way you can objectively say that this is the exact value of wavelength where something stops being red and starts being like blue, for example.
Yeah.
You can't really objectively come up with that line. So you definitely have to build more kind of like subjective lines between these categories, much like the subjective line between a butch woman and a tomboy is very subjective.
Right. Right. Probably changes depending on who you ask too.
Totally, yeah. I also like to use that kind of example, even with like that little colored lamp behind me, asking people like, how many colors do you see on that lamp? Because the
Yeah.
objective truth is that there's the spectrum of colors, but somebody might say, well, there's that pink and blue, there's two colors. Some might say, I also see purple, I see a third color. But then you could say, well, there's that purplish pink as kind of a fourth color, there's that blue violet as like a fifth color. Some might say, well, there's really infinite colors because it is like a spectrum. So definitely kind of shows how when we try to categorize things, even if something exists in objective reality, like the wavelength of light, our categorization of that objective reality is socially constructed.
I definitely, this is maybe getting a little philosophical, but I don't think that objective reality is sensible in the sense that it's way too nuanced for like a human brain to actually be able to understand. But then we come along anyways, and we try to make, as you said, like social constructs just to make sense of like what's going on around us so that we can do basic
Yeah,
basic
totally.
things like drink water and eat food and that kind of thing.
I'm with you there,
um,
but don't tell Jordan Peterson, or else you.
yeah, everything's a social construct, and then his face gets red and he cries over something.
These postmodernists have gone too far. Now they're saying that color is socially constructed. Those
Oh gosh,
bastards.
it is though. I will
It
say
absolutely
it.
is. Actually, different
It's
societies have had different like numbers
oh
of
yeah,
colors in their language, and like it kind of it changes the way in which they would like classify where certain colors begin and end on a color spectrum.
oh yeah.
Color is absolutely socially constructed.
Did you know that orange was just the fruit before it was a color? And they think that that affected the way people saw the color orange as just a shade of red.
Interesting. Yeah,
It was really interesting. But
actually, the name of this phenomenon you're referring to is called the Sapier-Whorf hypothesis.
yeah,
It's
that's
a
what it
very
was.
well-known linguistics hypothesis. The idea is that our language, which we have internalized into our brain, impacts how we conceptualize concepts. And yeah, it does. Depending on kind of the words we have to refer to concepts, we will have different forms of expressivity or different forms of connotations and context with which we understand concepts that will be culturally and linguistically relative, which is fascinating.
I do get a little bit concerned when people say XYZ is a social construct, because usually that comes with the context of, well, that means we can change it, or we should change it, or we should ignore it, or it's not valid in some sense. And I don't think, I think that that extra baggage is unfortunate in a lot of sense, because as we just said, basically everything is socially constructed. So when someone says XYZ is socially constructed, I have to wonder, okay, but what's your point? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think a lot
it's
of
definitely a one where it's a phrase that you have to be careful when you use it because there are a lot of
Mhm.
preconceived notions people have about the term social construct, and if you get too loose with your usage, then you're gonna get to a point where it's just like, well, everything's subjective and you can't really do anything. But yeah, no, definitely, I think people should be careful with their usage of the term social construct. But this was one of those conversations where we were absolutely getting at that idea.
I've definitely run into people, conservative-minded people, let's say, who they are critical of conversations that they've heard from trans people, and they'll go like, "Oh, they think gender is a social construct." Well, that's nonsense because it's really important. Or they'll criticize people by saying, "Oh, gender is a social construct," but then why is it important that you conform to such and such a gender?
I mean,
And
money's a
it's kind
social
of taking
construct.
that
It seems pretty
same
important.
yeah, it's that same thing of like, well, just because they said it's a social construct, that doesn't mean it's not important. It's, it's clearly important to them. Yeah.
Raymond is so
Well,
precious.
anyways, yeah.
Sorry, I've been
For sure.
distracted by my kitty who decided to make an appearance.
Oh, what's your cat's name?
This is Raymond. He is a wonderful, wonderful, precious boy.
Ah, hi, Raymond.
Raymond's doing pretty well ever since he got out of the hospital for his urinary blockage.
Oh, that does sound like a good improvement.
For sure, for sure. Well,
Cool.
hey, thanks for coming on the stream. I really appreciate the convo, and always good to end with some cat moments.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for helping clarify some things for me.
Yeah.
It's always good to be able to better understand these terms, that I can understand people when they're having conversations and can help me to contribute to conversations in a constructive way, and so forth.
My pleasure. No, that was really great to kind of dive into it. So thank you so much for coming on the stream. I appreciate it. I hope you have a lovely night.
Thanks. You too, Naomi.
Bye, Scott. Ooh, hey, that was awesome. I really, really appreciate those convos. Thank you so much for watching my content. I really appreciate the support, the engagement, anything you can do to help the channel. Like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell icon. All of it helps the channel way more than you realize. So thank you so much.